middle of the 5th chapter of the Laws of Tshuvah by the Rambam. And what he's told us so far is that we have the power to act. Nothing causes us, usually, to do what we do good or evil. Those who think that God set the world up in such a way that everything is determined are mistaken. And he quotes verses which say this in very clear fashion. And that since, and this is going to elaborate on in great detail, since we are the ones who are the authors of our own actions, therefore we should take responsibility for our actions. And if they are not correct, then we should do something to correct that, to repair that. And of course, that's what Tshuvah is. Tshuvah is what repairs actions which have gone wrong. We're okay with that from yesterday? Okay, so we're in the middle of the second page of the handout for those who have it. He's now going to explain why free will is such an important principle. Taking what he said before, but sort of making it prominent. Were God to decree that an individual will be righteous or wicked, or that there would be a quality which draws a person by its essential nature to any particular path of behavior. Now, draws here has to be read very strongly. Draws in a way that can't be resisted. Draws in the sense of causes to a path of behavior or a way of thinking or attributes or deeds as imagined by many of the fools who believe in astrology. They think that the stars control what happens here, including human behavior. How could he command us? So the words of the prophets, do this, do not do this, improve your behavior, do not follow after your wickedness. The first thing that in the Jewish tradition would be contradicted by such an idea is the exhortations that we have in the prophets, of which there are hundreds, where the prophets say, you're making these and these mistakes, you're committing these and these crimes, and you should change. If the stars or some other external force is causing these people to do what they do, there's no point in telling them to do otherwise, because they're not capable of doing otherwise. It would make a mockery of all of this text. According to their mistaken conception, from the beginning of man's creation, it would be decreed upon him, or his nature would draw him irresistibly, I keep putting in, to a particular quality, and he could not depart from it. What place would there be for the entire Torah? Now, that's one point. We see from the fact that the Torah gives us commands and exhortations that obviously we're not subject to external causation which we can't resist. Now he makes a different point. According to which judgment or sense of justice would punishment, retribution, be administered to the wicked or reward to the righteous? Shall not the world's judge act justly? So one thing we should note here is that he puts punishing the wicked before rewarding the righteous. That's certainly not obvious. If you're going to mention both of them, why not mention the positive one first? Well, let's work this out. Suppose a person does something wrong, and you say to him, you did something wrong. You did something evil. Suppose he says, tell me what I should have done instead. That sounds like a fair question. If you think that what he did was wrong, you're going to condemn him, criticize him, and perhaps punish him. At least you should be able to tell him what he should have done instead. Now, if he's forced to act and there's nothing that he can do to resist it, the answer is there's nothing he could have done instead. And if there's nothing he could have done instead, there's nothing he should have done instead. That's a little tricky. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But for the time being, that'll suffice. So when you condemn someone for doing something, especially if you punish him, you are clearly supposing that he had an alternative. That is to say, you are clearly supposing that he's not determined in what he does. And the Torah is full of threatened punishments. So the very fact that the Torah threatens us with punishments means that the Torah is committed to our making our own free choices, at least most of the time. Okay? Now, punishing the innocent is immoral. Punishing the innocent is a crime. When God tells Abraham that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if they have done the wickedness which is reported, Abraham vociferously objects. If there are righteous people there, you can't do that. You can't kill the righteous people. Ashafei kol ha'aretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? So it would be unjust to punish those who had no other choice, because since they had no other choice, they aren't wicked. Maybe the action that they performed was an unfortunate action. Maybe the action they performed was an action that violated the law. But they had no other choice. So to punish them would be wicked. Now let's compare that with the other half. What about giving a reward to people who aren't righteous? Giving a reward to people who aren't righteous, is that unjust? Is that criminal? Is that vicious? Giving a reward to people who aren't righteous? That would mean you're giving a reward to a person who didn't earn it. I'm not talking about a person who's hopelessly wicked. Just a person whose righteousness didn't give him a claim on receiving it. He hasn't earned it. Well, then it would be a free gift. Is it immoral to give someone a free gift? Not obviously. To be worthy of punishment, a person has to commit a crime which deserves that punishment. To be worthy of receiving something good, not always do you give to people who have earned it. Certainly nothing wrong. We think often that there's something very good about giving things to people who haven't earned them. It encourages them, it shows your concern for them. So the question we should need to ask is, why would he put these two things together? Listen, if people are determined in their actions, then you're going to have to explain punishing the wicked and rewarding rewarding the righteous. Rewarding the righteous. That is to say, they do good actions, but they couldn't have done anything else. They had no other choice. The one is clearly unjust, and the other one is not unjust. But there is a linguistic problem. Reward, by definition, is something you earned. If I give someone a free gift, there's no way in which that's a reward. Reward is always a response for something that has been done, and this is the outcome of what the person did. He received this because he did that. A free gift isn't like that. So even though there's nothing wrong with giving something good to a person who couldn't have done otherwise, but you can't call it reward, because he has no responsibility for what he did, just as he had no responsibility for the evil thing that he did. So both punishing the wicked and rewarding the righteous, both of them require us to assume that people's will is free, that they make decisions on their own. Okay, and then since the Torah has many, many, many promises of reward and threats of punishment, yes, and those two words aren't the same. We'll talk about that in this session. It must be that the Torah is presuming that people have free choice of what they do. Are we together? Okay, let me just try to convert this into more modern vocabulary, and I think it will give a little bit more depth to the idea. I did slip it in, but I want to emphasize it now. We talk about rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked. It's based on the idea of responsibility. You only deserve punishment for an action that you're responsible for. And reward also for an action you're responsible for. And the challenge of what should I have done? What other things should I have done? Is a way of saying I'm not responsible. Why am I not responsible? Well, I'm not responsible because it isn't my will that brought it about. And if it isn't my will that brought it about, it's not traceable to me. So here's an example. George is standing at the head of a flight of stairs, facing downwards, and Peter sneaks up behind him and gives him a shove, and he tumbles down the stairs. And at the bottom of the stairs, sitting on the landing, there's a 5th century Ming vase worth $100,000 belonging to Philip. And George's body crashes into the Ming vase and smashes it to smithereens. And Philip is upset about it. It's only $100,000. So he says to George, "What's the matter with you? Why did you do that?" He said, "It's not me. Peter pushed me." You didn't see Peter pushing me. You thought I just dove down the stairs and rolled down on my own? No. Peter pushed me. Doesn't Philip give up his critique of George? He was pushed. So the smashing belongs to Peter who pushed him. George was like the stick in Peter's hand with which Peter used to smash the vase. So if he has anyone to complain to, he should complain to Peter, because George didn't choose it. Now let's stretch it out a little bit. Let's suppose George is a smoker and he wants to kick the habit. And one of the means that he's using is post-hypnotic suggestion. Every Thursday night, he goes to the hypnotist and he puts him under and he says, "No more smoking, no more smoking." George doesn't remember this. That's the way hypnosis works. But the rest next week, typically he doesn't smoke because he's working on the basis of that post-hypnotic suggestion. Now let's imagine that the hypnotist frivolously, irresponsibly, viciously, while George is under a Thursday night, says to him, "George, next Monday morning at 10 a.m., your right fist is going to swing out in front of you like this." You won't remember this when you wake up, but 10 a.m., so Monday morning, the right fist is coming out like this. George wakes up, pays his money, "Thank you very much." Monday morning, George is visiting his friend Philip. You may remember him. And Philip is giving George a tour of his antiquities. And at 9:59, they arrive at the pedestal on which there is sitting a 5th century Ming vase. And he's explaining where it came from and where the artwork came from and how much it cost and so forth and so on. And in the meantime, in the corner, there's a grandfather clock bonging the hour of 10. And when it reaches the 10th bong, George's hand swings out and smashes the vase. And Philip says, "Twice?" I mean, no, it's a different story. "You did again? You smashed my vase. What's the matter with you?" George says, "I don't know. I really don't know. This has never happened to me before. It sort of went out all by itself. Like it just went out. I don't know what to say." Is George responsible for smashing Philip's vase? I don't think so. He didn't want to do it. If he had anticipated it, he would have stopped it. It's the viciousness of the hypnotist who planted that hypnotic suggestion in him, which is responsible for the smashing the vase. So again, where action, I'm going to use slightly broader words, where the action is disconnected from one's free will, then one is not responsible for the action. If you're not responsible, then you're not liable to punishment for the damage. You're not liable. It's not appropriate to receive reward for some constructive effects of what you do. If it wasn't your will that led you to do it. And if you're not responsible, then of course reward and punishment don't apply. Now, let me draw out a conclusion from this, which some people find very distasteful. Why do we do what we do? Why do we develop the way we develop it, make the choices we make, and set goals that we make? There is a story, popular in some quarters, that the sum total of all of what you are is due to your DNA and to environmental influence. That's all you are. Your DNA sets certain concrete elements in the composition of your body and whatever else. It's dependent on the body, to the extent to which the mind and the emotions are dependent on the body. And after that, it's prenatal experiences and postnatal experiences and family and neighborhood and school and friends and trips and so forth and so on. All of that molds you, and you're nothing but clay. And what you are at any particular time in your life is just a result of the DNA and the environment molding you into what you are at that time. And that determines everything about you, including what you do, including what you think, including what you want, including what you call your decisions. You experience them as you choosing what to do, but if you experience them as coming from yourself and only from yourself, originating in yourself, according to this story, that's just a mistake. You don't realize that it's all completely caused and programmed by your DNA and your environmental influences on you. Well, if that's true, then for the third time, it's not your will that's responsible for what you do. It's not your will bringing about what you do. And according to that, you won't be responsible for what you do. And this story is really the story of all human development and animal development and milkshakes and puddings and the grass and the stars. It's all one physicalistic package. Then no one is ever responsible for anything that he does. Well, that's a thought that needs to be considered, sort of. I mean, on the one hand, I want to be up to date with what they say in the smart circles, don't I? Isn't that what they say? All the scientists and all the philosophers, don't they all say that it's all DNA and environment? I don't want to be, against the smartest people in the world. But on the other hand, do I really want to draw the conclusion that no one is ever responsible for anything that he does? That does seem a bit tough. It certainly would force me to reorganize my life, my relationships, my judgments, my reactions. The French have a motto: the more you know, the less there is to forgive, or something like that. It's only ignorance that leads us to think that there were other possibilities. But if we knew more, we'd realize that there is no other possibilities for what you do. Now, this is a famous problem in contemporary philosophy, and there is a variety of ways of dealing with it. I'm not going to take you through all of them. They're complicated and subtle in various ways. Free will is a very difficult subject. I'll tell you what I believe the Torah position has to be. The Torah position has to be that story they told you isn't true. It isn't true that you are no more than your DNA and your environmental influences. That's just not true. And I tell you, having done some of the reading on the subject, that there certainly is no adequate reason to believe it. There's no adequate reason to believe it. Now, if you've been here for a while, you realize that I make an effort to choose my words with care. I didn't say it's false. I didn't say it's disproven. I said there's no adequate reason to believe it. There may not be an adequate reason to reject it either. Those two are compatible. But they sell it as done, finished, established, known, proven. And that's just wrong. That's just wrong. Certainly in philosophy, nothing has that status because everything is controversial. You want to get a picture of how controversial philosophy is, take out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is free online, and just look up any subject. And the presentation of, and these are the best philosophers in the world, it's run by Stanford University. They tell you what the subject matter is about, and they give you the 5 leading positions. And then they point out that each leading position contradicts the other leading positions, and so there are difficulties back and forth. And then they have a final paragraph: what progress can we expect? But almost nothing is settled. And in science, there's great gaps in the bravado on the one hand and the real evidence on the other hand. So I think the Jewish position has to be, we reject that story. It's simply not true that you are nothing but your DNA and environmental influences. There's more to human being than that. More to his composition and more to the elements that are in play when he makes a decision and he acts as he acts. And that being the case, I don't have to worry that the DNA environment story means that you have no free will. It's not true because it's a mistaken picture of what the human being is. Yeah.
So I don't believe that it takes over the entire control, but you don't think it plays a factor in who we are?
Okay, so now I'll invite you to take into account what I said 120 seconds ago. I choose my words very carefully.
Yeah, no, I know you didn't say that, but I'm saying, like, would you agree that it takes some form, like, the friends that we have when we're younger and the places we are?
So here's a little piece of interpreting what people say, and a little piece of logic. If I thought that the environmental and the DNA played no role in influencing what you do, that's what I should have said. What I said is much weaker than that. Much weaker than that. I only ruled out that it's the absolute, complete cause. So if I only say that, I'm implying that it does have influence. I'm only ruling out the most extreme case. All the other cases are, of course, they have an influence. We do recognize, for example, that some decisions are harder and some decisions are easier. And that's definitely affected by the environment and your inherent constitution. So there's no question that they influence what you do. But that's not the same, nearly the same, as causing you to do what you do. Just think, for example, for a moment of social pressure. You know, if everybody's doing it and you have a reason to be different, that's really tough. You know you're going to stand out. You know you're going to attract attention. You may attract criticism. Now you think to yourself, I could do it. Be a big penalty, but I could do it, but it wouldn't be easy. And if, on the contrary, some people are doing it, some people aren't, and let's say it's 60-40, so if you decide either way, you've got a large portion of the population that's similar to what you're doing. That makes it a much easier decision. Let's say you got to move from the 60 to the 40. Okay. So some decisions are easier, some decisions, and here it's the peer pressure, which is the force that you have to overcome. So in the one case, the peer pressure is much stronger, and in the other case, the peer pressure is much weaker. So obviously, they're going to be influenced from external factors. No one is denying that. The only question is whether you're able to overcome it with free will. And no one, I said this carefully also, no one's saying everything you do is a result of free will. No. There are cases where you're overwhelmed. That does happen. Some people, for example, when they're frightened, freeze. They just can't move. When in the Second World War, when American soldiers went to Europe and they had to fight battles, something like 10% of the soldiers, when they heard the bullets flying, they just froze. Standing up, full targets for the other side, because they couldn't move. So sometimes you don't have free will to choose, but a lot of the time you do have free will to choose. So even though there's pressure, and you know yourself from your own life, so you do something and you feel very, very good about it. Why? Because there was something very valuable at stake, and it was very tough, and I did it. I managed to overcome the pressure and do it. So that's an indication that you were under the influence of that pressure and you overcame it. So we definitely agree that there's influence. We just disagree that there's causation. Okay? I'm not going to be able to do it now, but I have a series of shiurim on the nature of consciousness or the nature of decision and soul, where I argue for the idea that consciousness is not physical. If consciousness is not physical, then a lot of you is not just DNA and environmental influence. So that's recorded. You can look it up if it interests you.
Meaning, what do you mean by consciousness?
You know what I mean by consciousness. Consciousness means
being, your being, your thoughts,
thoughts, feelings, emotions. hopes, fears, decisions, things that you experience.
Where do you have this recorded?
I'm sorry?
I'll get to that.
It's negative. It's not physical. There's very strong arguments that it's not physical. Not everybody agrees, but I told you, philosophy, nothing's agreed upon by everybody. Okay, so the Rabbi was telling us that free will is absolutely necessary for responsibility. Now he's going to address another problem, bottom of the second page. A person should not wonder, how is it possible for one to do whatever he wants and be responsible for his own deeds? And here, doing it on his own and being responsible, he puts in the same sentence. What's the problem? Why shouldn't that be so? Is it possible for anything to happen in this world without the permission and desire of its creator? As the verse in Psalm says, whatever God wishes, he has done in the heavens and the earth. We said yesterday, what do we mean when we say the will is free? What does free will mean? Well, we said free means free from external causation. And as I said yesterday, that means all external causation. Not only DNA and not only environment and the rest, but also divine causation. So the Rambam is saying, is that possible? That there's sort of a piece of the world that God is running continuously, which somehow he isn't running? And he doesn't ask it as a philosophical question. He asks it by citing a verse in Psalms. That whatever happens in the world, what he desires, what he wants, that's what happens. But we could also ask it as a philosophical question. How are we supposed to imagine that God, causes the motions of the atoms and causes the motions of the planets and the galaxies and the stars and all the rest, and manages the wind blowing and the water flowing and the properties of wood and steel and all the rest, and the functioning of man's body, right? All the rest of that. And yet, man's decision, he's not managing. Like, how do we picture this idea that sort of a piece of it is left unmanaged, uncaused, undirected? How does it operate if it's undirected? So you could think of it philosophically. So now, the Rambam gives the following answer. One must know that everything is done in accord with his will. Before he spoke about permission and desire. Now he says in accord with his will. And nevertheless, we are responsible for his deeds. Now, when someone changes his vocabulary, your hair stands on end and say, oh, so it's not like he said before. It's not really the same as it was before. How is this apparent contradiction resolved? Just as the Creator desired that the elements of fire and wind rise upwards, and those of water and earth descend downward. So, a fire burns and it flickers upward spontaneously against gravity. The wind blows in all directions and often can blow up just as much as it can blow down. Fire and wind spontaneously operate against gravity. Water and solid earth, you drop it, down it goes. Why? Well, from the point of view of his purpose, the Rambam is pointing out that God creates the world, created originally as a start, and continues infusing it with its existence and all of its properties. So ultimately, when fire goes up, it's because God wants it to go up. When earth falls, when you release it, it's because he wants it to go down. And the heavenly spheres revolve in a circular orbit. Their picture was that, of course, the universe revolves around the earth. And all other creations of the world follow the nature which he desired for them. Okay. So his will covers everything. Everything has its nature programmed, created by God. So too, he desired that man have free will. That's the nature he wanted man to have. Just like he wanted the fire to go up and the earth to go down and the heavens to revolve circularly, he wants us to have free will and be responsible for our deeds. This turns the question on its head. You're asking how the world could be the way it is with a corner that he doesn't cause to function? The question comes back to you. Are you imagining that God lacks the power to make the world the way he wants? Why would you imagine that? He wants the fire to go up, he wants the earth to go down, he wants the heavens to go circularly, and he wants people to have free will. Are you going to imagine that he can't do that if he wants? It's beyond him? Why would that be? It means he wants something to operate on its own. He wants it to operate on its own. Why can't that be? There's a very, very sharp point here. I'm just realizing now myself that this is similar to something that the Ramchal writes. And since some of you know the background for this, I'm going to mention it because it's you'll see how these ideas connect. We say twice every morning that God continuously makes the creation. Mechadesh Tomid Ma'aser Bereshis. He's continuously making new the creation. Why is he doing that? Why is he doing that? So Ramchal, the Ma'amar al Chochmah, which has several editions, in one of the editions, he asks this question, and he says, don't tell me that he has to. Don't tell me that without his making it, things would cease to exist. There's no limit on what he can do. If he wanted to, he could make it, and he could make it so that it will exist without his making it. So you have to ask why he did that. And Ramchal's answer, to me, it was totally unexpected when I read it. It's what we call a musar vort. It's a spiritual reason. He says, because the whole purpose of man's creation is that man should enter into a certain relationship with God, which is called poetically dveikus, which means attachment. But no, it's not superglue. It's a kind of relationship that you can have with God. And in order to construct that relationship with him, he has to be available. If he created the world and gave it its ability to exist independently of his input, then he wouldn't be present anymore. And then in the world, it would just be the world and us. His will continuously creates it, which means that his will is present to us in everything that we experience in our whole environment, even in our own being. And therefore, he's available to us so that we can create that relationship with him. So he gives a spiritual answer to this question. But from his question, you see, there's no reason philosophically why God can't create something which will continue to exist without his input. He just doesn't do it that way. That's what we say in the prayers. He renews the creation every moment continuously because he chooses to do that. So similarly, there's no reason to deny God the power to create something which not only will exist on its own, but will act on its own, will originate its own behavior. Of course, it'll originate its own behavior only because God is giving it existence and life and giving it the power of free will continuously. That's true. Without God, he wouldn't have the power of free will. But what the outcome will be, whether he chooses to eat the cheeseburger or chooses not to eat the cheeseburger, that's going to be up to him. God is not causing that. So even though, and now when the person, now comes the tricky part. So God wants the person to exercise free will. Now, let's take Ruvain Schwartz, and it's 2-for-1 sale at McDonald's. Well, kashrus is very important, you know. It says so in the Torah, and yeah, but it's 2-for-1. Maybe I'll keep kosher next week. How about that? No, this week, and he struggles with himself. Let's say he chooses to keep kosher. So is that according to God's will? Sure. First of all, he made a free choice. And since God wants us to make free choices, he made a free choice. And furthermore, he chose to keep kosher, which is certainly what God wants. But now, suppose he chooses to take advantage of the sale and eat the cheeseburger. Is that according to God's will? Well, here the picture is a little more complex. The Rambam is telling us that God wants us to make free choices. And he did. He made a free choice to eat the cheeseburger. But doesn't God also want us to keep kosher? And he didn't do that. And indeed, if God wants us to keep kosher, on the previous page, the Rambam quoted that whatever God wishes, he has done. And doesn't God wish him to keep kosher? So isn't his eating the cheeseburger not in accordance with God's will? Here, like the medieval said, when you have a contradiction, you make a distinction. Here we have to think very carefully about what it means to be in accord with God's will or against God's will. Let's ask this question. God wants us to keep kosher. That's very simple. Program it. Move the muscles. He thinks of the cheeseburger, his arms go limp. Too bad. Limp arms. No cheeseburger for you. Can't God arrange it that we should only eat kosher? He certainly can. But that's not what he wants. What he wants is for us to freely choose to keep kosher. That's what he wants. And God can't get that by manipulating our muscles. Because if he manipulates our muscles, then it isn't freely chosen. What he wants is for us to freely choose to keep kosher. So he can't force that. By forcing it, he deprives us of free will. It's just simply not what he wants to happen. So yes, there is a big difference between keeping kosher and eating cheeseburgers, but the difference is not in accord with God's will or not in the strict sense. It's a much more subtle sense. He wants us to make free decisions, and in both ways, the person makes a free decision. He has a, so to speak, a preference for what we should decide, but he's not willing that we should decide it. If he willed it, it would happen. He wills the stars into existence, he wills the weather, and if he willed us to do something, we would do it. But that's not what he wants. What he wants is us to will it. So, in exercising free will, no matter what we choose, we are performing an activity that God wants us to perform. But then, there's also a preference that he has that we should do it in a certain way, but that preference can't be a will, because if it were a will, it would automatically come true, that we would do it, and it wouldn't be free will at all. So, you have to, let's put it this way. Maybe this is a surprising conclusion. There's some things that God would prefer which he cannot provide. Some things he cannot do for himself that he would prefer happen. Because the thing that he prefers is that something should happen not done by him. That's what he prefers. Since what he prefers is something not done by him, he can't do it. Because otherwise it would be done by him. So creating free will does have a cost. It has the cost that, in a certain sense, God's preferences can be frustrated. But of course, he chose this. It's not as if this was imposed upon him. It doesn't bespeak any lack of power. It bespeaks the consequences of the decision that he made. You cannot guarantee by your power that people will freely do what you want them to freely do. But just otherwise it would be a contradiction. So this is what's behind the Rambam's solution here. Yes, everything happens in accordance with his will, as far as in accordance with his will is possible on pain of contradiction. But of course, if it's going to be a contradiction, that's something which we don't allow. If you ask why is that, I'll answer it. If you don't ask it, I won't answer it. If you want to push it back to the source of why contradictions are a limitation, I can do that. But, huh? Why is it? Our sources, the Rambam says this in the Guide of the Perplexed, our sources say that we do not describe God as doing or being able to do things that are contradictory. The Rambam's example is this, one of his examples. Imagine making a square whose diagonal is exactly as long as one of the sides. It's got to be longer, right? It's got further to go, right? No. So we don't describe God as making a square or being able to make a square with a diagonal just exactly as long as one of the sides. Why don't we do that? Now, the Rambam's words I don't understand. I've asked Rabbi Matalan and other people, and I don't understand how the explanation of it. I'll tell you his words, and then I'll tell you how we, in modern terms, could explain it. The Rambam says the impossible has a fixed nature. And since it has a fixed nature, it's no weakness to say that God can't violate it because it has a fixed nature. Now, clever people think right away, oh yeah? It has a fixed nature? How did it get that fixed nature? Didn't God give it? Didn't God create all of nature? Everything in nature? And if he created it, why can't he have control over it? Good questions. I don't know the answer to those questions. I'll tell you another way to think about it, which gets you the same conclusion, and which is in accord with some of modern philosophy. As I told you, nothing's in accord with all of it, because it contradicts itself. But here's one way to think about it. I'll give you an illustration, and then I'll draw the moral from it. You're on your way to the mall, and a friend calls you up. You're going to the mall? Yes. Listen, have you got a little free time? Yes. And have you got a spare $25? Yes. Okay, please do me a favor and pick up for me a square circle. Okay. What do you do now? Buy it for him? I think you say, what? A square circle? What do you mean by that? I hear the words. I know what square is, I know what circle is, but when you put the two of them together, nothing lights up in here. No light bulbs, no brain processes. It's just a blank. If you can explain to me what you want in other terms that I can understand, I'll be happy to try to help you. But if that's all you can say, I'm going to have to beg off because I don't know what you're talking about. Contradictions don't communicate a meaning. They don't communicate an idea.
How about for the Arum and the...
I'll come to that. This is all written up, by the way, on my website. So since they don't communicate an idea, when someone says, well, why can't God do that? The response should be, which that? Tell me what you mean, what he should do. You say he should make a square circle? Sorry, you're not talking to me. You're using words that, to me, have no meaning. They're words that don't communicate any idea to me. You haven't asked a question. When you ask the question, can God do that? I don't know what you're talking about because I don't know what the that is. So that means that entertaining the idea that that God should do what's described by a contradiction is entertaining a non-idea. The failure is with us. It's not that the laws of logic are so powerful that even God can't violate the laws of logic. No, that's the wrong picture. The picture is the laws of logic are the laws of how you make sense when you talk. They're laws for us, not for God. And if you violate the laws of logic, you just don't make sense. If you don't make sense, you haven't asked the question, you don't deserve an answer, nothing to talk about. Nothing to talk about, nothing to think about. That's the way I think to get to the same conclusion that we're not going to describe God in contradictory terms. Now you point out, quite correctly, that in our tradition, we have contradictory descriptions. So the Aron is supposed to be 10 tefachim across, and the size of the enclosure that it's in is 20 wide, and it's sitting in the center, and there's 10 tefachim of space on this side, and 10 tefachim of space on that side. And you say, wait a second, Rabbi, 10 in the middle, 10 on this side, 10 on that side, that's 30. And the space is only 20. How does that work, Rabbi? Isn't that a contradiction? And the answer is, yeah, it's a contradiction. And worse than that, I suppose, there's a verse that says that at Sinai, the whole nation saw the voices. And you can't see voices. And don't talk to me about synesthesia. In synesthesia, you hear a sound and see a color. You hear a trumpet and you see red. What you hear is the trumpet. What you see is red, which isn't a voice, it's a color. Synesthesia is where hearing and vision, the neural pathways cross, so they interact with one another and they can cause secondary effects. Now this means the speech of I am was seen instead of heard, or maybe in addition to heard. So I think the right way to handle that is this. I'll give you another analogy, and then I'll explain how it works here. Imagine that you are accompanying Einstein on a world tour of explaining relativity. You're also a physicist. You're also very good. And one of the places he comes to is China. He gets up to give his lecture, and people ask you questions afterwards, so as not to bother him. They're simple questions, so you're on tap there. And Einstein gets up and he starts to speak, and lo and behold, he starts speaking in Chinese. Wow, you think. I didn't know Einstein knew Chinese. Okay, but it's Einstein. In the middle of the lecture, one Chinese scientist grabs your arm and says, "Is what Einstein just said really true?" Is what Einstein just said really true? Well, I don't know what he really said because I don't speak Chinese. I don't understand Chinese. But you know what? He's very reliable. So I'm sure it is true. It's just, I don't know what he said. Right? So I think that's the attitude we have to have here. We have contradictory expressions in a literature which to us is absolutely credible, absolutely fundamentally true. Someone asked me, is it true? I asked, what do you mean by the it? You mean, is what it says true? It doesn't say anything to me. When I read the words, nothing goes on in here. Do those words in that order say something true? Of course. They're part of the literature and part of our sources. And of course there's something true. So, sure, it's true. I just don't know what it's saying. I think that's the best we can do. We can verify that these words stand for something, but we have no clue what it is because they're written in a contradictory form. There may be another reading, or it may be a secret code that gives rise to another meaning, or there are other ways to relate to it. But given what the words mean, and given my understanding of the language, there's nothing there to say. It's a little bit like this. There's a children's song, God is here, God is there, God is everywhere. And according to most Jewish philosophical thought, God isn't, I hope this is going to be too shocking, God is not here in the room with us. To be here in the room would be to have a physical position. That would make God physical. God is not physical. Sorry. So the Zohar says, there's no place empty of him. That's what the words say. That's what they say. Correct. Gee, I know in my holy book called the Tanakh, it talks about God's eyes and God's ears and God's head and God's legs. That's what it says. Oh, of course, Rabbi, but we know that's not literal. Oh, really? It's not literal. No, it means something else about his powers and his caring and his attributes and so forth and so on. It's not literal. Okay. Couldn't the Zohar also not be literal? The Zohar says no place is empty of him. That means he's got to be in the room? Maybe not. Maybe it means something else. Okay? Or must I have different rules for the Tanakh on one hand and all the rest of Jewish literature on the other hand? Why should I have that? Why should I assume that? So one explanation of what the Zohar says is this, what I said before. God's will supports the existence of everything that exists. Without his will, it wouldn't exist. And in that sense, nothing is disconnected from him. For were disconnected, were there no interaction between this thing and him, it wouldn't exist. And the Zohar uses a spatial metaphor to explain this kind of dependence, but not more than that. And indeed, there's a Chazal that says, "Hu mekomo shel olam, lo ha'olam mekomo." He's the place of the world, not the world is his place. So if the world isn't his place, then he isn't in the room, right? So that's the way you look at these statements. But on the surface, they're incomprehensible because they are contradictory, and you find a different meaning for them. And the meaning is not just arbitrary. It's not when you say that no place is empty of him. What you're really saying is baseball is more fun than football. It's the idea of nothing's empty means nothing is really disconnected. Nothing's out of his range. Nothing is beyond him. And the him then becomes his will, and then it becomes much easier to understand. His will is creating everything continuously that exists. And then you get a meaning for it. So I'm assuming that there's some meaning like that in the contradictions that we mentioned. You mentioned one, I mentioned the other one, or some kind of meaning that we can't imagine. But the words, as we understand them, with the rules of language that we understand, don't communicate any meaning. And I think that can be sustained even so. Okay, this is pretty tough stuff today. I will start tomorrow with a review, yes Hashem, and then go on to more material.